Wow, that sounded way more official than I deserve. That was nice.
Awesome. So today we're super lucky to have a talk from Ben Weinstein. Ben is someone who I think is probably closer to all of you because he actually came into all of this from an ecology background. He, and actually still really, I think, identifies mostly as an ecologist. Yeah, Ben?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, exactly. But he started getting involved in computer vision methods for ecology 4 or 5 years ago, and has systematically really started to try to tackle a lot of these larger challenges that face the sort of effective and large-scale use and deployment of models, and making models that are really usable for lots of different people, lots of different organizations, as opposed to just one-off models that only work for one group at a time. Yeah, so thanks so much, Ben, and yeah, take it away.
Sure, awesome. And yeah, you guys are welcome to interrupt me. Most of you know I'm a pretty laid back guy, so just shout and I'll stop if I didn't say anything that is confusing. I'm looking at that screen and I'm saying, okay, so if I slide forward, this should all work. Shout me if anything doesn't work on the AV side of things. So thanks for coming to the talk. Yeah, what I want to talk today a little bit about is how I think the field can move forward. Especially, it's nice to talk to people who are actively engaging in their own research projects and thinking about what it means to use computer vision on a daily basis. So as Sarah said, if I do that, let's slide forward. Yeah, that looks okay. Everything looks okay. So yeah, I started out as a ornithologist working in Ecuador during my PhD. I was at Stony Brook with KC, and my research program was a very typical research program, right? We were interested in birds and flowers, biotic, and I got very into Bayesian statistical model and trying to understand different kinds of and inference for predictive ecology. And so I did from each of the last 5-6 years and just together, and even sort of vision time. Oh, that's all. That was gold. That was just bonus. And so it was very clear to me, right? The center paradigm of a grad student goes out, collects data, writes a bunch of papers on it, gets a PhD, had a limited ability to answer the kind of questions that we needed to answer in ecology and in conservation. There's just simply not enough summers or times to get into the field to observe data with the kinds of rigor we need to answer things in a predictive fashion. We just need more observation, and it's not possible with human observation to really do the things we need to do. And so it felt like there was an opportunity to move beyond what we were currently doing. And so my own window into this was we started setting up time-lapse cameras at flowers and taking a photo every second. So it was like 48,000 photos a day, 2 terabytes of photos a month, and having hundreds of cameras in the field, trying to record hummingbirds visiting flowers to create this very large network. And very quickly, of course, the problem was finding birds within those images and developing computer vision models to understand when we should actually review and classify frames. And from there, it was so obvious that the field needed these tools. I just put up this stupid little tool called Motion Meerkat on my website, and I was getting 10, 15 downloads a week of just like, I have a frame, I have sets of frames, and I need to know what's in this object. Okay, at minute 37, there's a shark. And so it became so clear that the community was dying for these tools that it was obvious that my research program should just be this. And so I started to develop more and more focus on the computer vision aspects of it. And that sort of led me to where I am now. And so maybe 5 years ago, 6 years ago, really now, I wrote a paper called A Computer Vision for Animal Ecology. The title was given to me by the head of AI for Earth at the time, Lucas Joppa. And it was just one of these simple review papers that was just trying to catalog, like, what is computer vision for ecology? It was a real infancy moment, 6 or 7 years ago. What is it we're trying to do? What do those pieces look like? And the paper got a lot of response, and it was very obvious that students in particular needed to be educated about what these tools are and how to move forward. So I thought I would use the first part of this talk to think a little bit about like, where have we been in the last 5 years since I wrote this paper, and like what lessons have we learned? Mike, sounding okay? Someone give me a thumbs up. Everything's okay? You can hear me all right? Cool. Thanks, Casey. All right. So, right, we've learned a few things. One is that there's been a real frame shift between where we started and where we are now. When we started, 5, 6, 7 years ago, computer vision for ecology was a kind of cool thing. And it wasn't really clear if it was going to work at all, right? Like these standard sets of models. But now I would say that it's become a very common tool for ecological monitoring. There are hundreds of research projects that use this stuff. All of you are here because you've either heard about it or used it yourself or believe that it has some promise. And so it went from a thing of like, what's that? Like, what's computer vision? To like a pretty reasonable paradigm within ecology and conservation biology. And so that's a really important sea change, just that there's notification and awareness of these tools. The second is that we kind of know that it works. Given enough data and given the architectures and given good annotation strategies, we can develop simple models of object detection and classification that will have real impact in tangible ecological and conservation projects. So this is one of the projects I'll talk about today. We work in the Everglades on bird detection and classification. And this is my field manager, Lindsay Garner, doing some drone surveys, and she's out there on an airboat almost every day. So all the images you'll see today is probably from Lindsay. Huge shout out to her incredible work ethic and flying, hundreds of terabytes of drone data every year. So what are some paradigms that we've learned that I hope, if you learn nothing else from this talk, just this slide, like just this is it, and you'll really be fine. One is that data always matters. And there is a natural hope for machine learning in general that it's going to be some sort of panacea. It's going to be some sort of magic box that's going to allow us to transcend our challenges. But of course, that's not really true. If you, as a human, can't identify the object of interest in your data, then the computer can't either, or usually can't in most situations. If you have poor quality data, you will have poor quality results. And so that seems obvious, but you will see a lot of research projects wherein they were hoping the machine learning algorithm would make up for the fact that their data wasn't very good. And so as applied ecologists or conservation biologists or sort of whoever you are in the room, think about how you and your responsibility to make the data as good as possible, even before an algorithm gets involved. And that's really important because no gap is going to be made up for by the algorithm with data. So we've learned that. We've learned that annotations are paramount. Usually just annotating more images will get you where you need to go. It's not sexy, it's not fun, it's not going to get you into a high journal, but truthfully, sitting at a computer and clicking on stuff, if you're stuck, is always the right choice. Algorithms are pretty much infinitely hungry for data, especially in the kind of spaces that we work in. There's very little chance that you will exhaust the learning ability of your algorithm. So if you're feeling stuck and you're not getting the results you want, take 2 weeks, do nothing but listen to music and annotate your thing, and you will be a happy person. That leads us to a third sort of thing with a little caveat, because it's a little snarky, but architecture rarely matters. There is a difference in the paradigm between publishing and computer vision, especially at the interface of ecology and actual computer vision research, and what it takes to make applied projects work. And very rarely is it changes in architecture, especially on the like, does this thing need more dropout or a deeper CNN filter? That very rarely will make a difference compared to your data and your annotations. The kinds of tools which develop convolutional neural network setups are so well refined that for most problems that I see on a day-to-day basis, and this is all I do all day for close to 8 years now, very rarely is it like, oh, if I just had another dropout layer, I'd get 20% better performance. That almost never happens. There are some, of course, caveats. Sometimes architecture matters a lot. And I can talk about a couple examples where it can be transformative. But in general, we would say that architecture matters very little unless you're doing something unique or interesting that has a really strong logical basis to it. But there's usually not a black box like I just added another deeper neural network and it made it better. That almost never happens. Questions? Does that all make sense to people? Those are 3 really good rules of thumb. Nothing else I'm going to say today matters as much as that. Okay, so one of the things that goes along with machine learning via magic sort of wand is that you need to know that generalization is not free. It doesn't just automatically happen. And neural networks are incredibly good. I'm sure Sarah's talked about this ad nauseum through this week. Neural networks are incredibly good at learning things that you don't want them to know, and that you've thought you've taught it something, but it turns out what you've taught it is something completely different. So imagine we have a shape detector. Imagine we have a circle versus triangle detector, and I'm training it on a bunch of circles and a bunch of triangles, and I'm like, this performance is awesome. I am so good at identifying circles versus triangles, right? What is a danger that we already can see immediately in this setup? It's that the background of these images encodes something about our target object. That's all well and good if the background and your target object are always going to be married. You shouldn't look down on any feature that might be auxiliary to your target instance. But danger approaches. If you can suddenly now get a circle with a different background and you've taught it, you got to be very careful. And this isn't just a weird little cartoon example. I know Sarah has seen this personally, right, Sarah, in camera traps, learning the background of their cameras and which animals are more likely to come through that camera. And so what
more insidiously, we had one example where the cameras, we had one project that had one type of camera that had one type of logo in the corner. And then we got a new project halfway around the world that was the only other project that we'd seen that had that type of logo. And we'd, before that, done all of this systematic evaluation to determine how much the logos were contributing. And we were like, oh, it's not really affecting performance, so I guess it's fine to leave them in. Big mistake, because then we got this new set of data from Israel and basically started predicting that everything was like a nutria, which is like an invasive rodent that's only in California. So logos.
Like, you have to be incredibly careful and thoughtful about the black box nature of neural networks. And I see this so often. Once you start training your eye to see it, when you're looking at your train test data, just start being incredibly critical and cynical about the train test split and ask yourself, are there ways in which my generalization will be negatively impacted by the way I'm splitting data or by the way I'm structuring data? Because I would say that 60% of the projects that I just sort of like drop into, like people are like, oh, I'm having trouble. Can you come like look at our thing? This is almost always the problem. If they have sufficient annotations, it's that they haven't thought about how it's structured. I wanted to be somewhat polite about this, so I didn't show whose paper this is. So this is a random paper, but I promise it's published in a very reputable journal this year. And I wanted to show what this looks like when you start training your eye for it. This is a tree species classification paper. Each of those colors is a species, and that is how they've collected their testing data, right? No amount of splitting geographically will ever get you generalization in this paradigm. The reason is that you've always said green is in this part of the forest, purple is in this part of the forest, and yellow is up here. But of course, your goal was to predict all of the tree species here. And so you've encoded a geographic signal into your neural network, which means that you're going to get fantastic results. The evaluation score on this paper is so high, and of course it is because they can't possibly train test split in any way to each other. And this stuff is super important, is that there's no evaluation score from this sampling regime, which is going to be, I don't know if the word believable is fair, but it's not going to generalize the way that you want to write your conclusion section, right? You can't then take the model that was trained on data that looks like this and apply it to all of the trees, because there's so much spatial autocorrelation in your train test here that the evaluation score is of course going to be high, but your prediction score, which of course you're not evaluating, is going to be ridiculously low. And this is an extraordinarily common problem in computer vision for ecology, mostly because our systems are spatially autocorrelated. Sandhill cranes like this wetland habitat, whereas Gadwall like it over here. And now you've got a neural network that's learning that sand background is Sandhill crane and light marsh is Gadwall. And now you've got a huge problem when the Sandhill crane flies over the marsh. This kind of thing is so common that it may not be attractive, but it really is a major barrier to successful neural network application. Does that make sense? Questions? Okay.
Would that be correct? Because I see that's cluster data. So you've got clusters of points of different classes. Would that be correct that if you had more images with always these clusters, or would the shape of the clusters start
That's an interesting question. I think if you could destroy the clusters somehow, right? You need to find a green tree over here somewhere. Even if you had repeat samples, I think you're still encoding it. So you need to break your spatial autocorrelation in some way, unless it's so strong and so useful that you want to encode it. You shouldn't look down on it. If you only care about predicting this one image and spatial autocorrelation is a reasonable feature, like don't be afraid, but know what you're doing rather than sort of falling into an evaluation score, right? The evaluation score in this paper is like 95% accuracy. And anytime you see anything that should be hard, but it's 95% accurate, you have to ask yourself what's happening. There is one other sort of paradigm here. Is my Zoom little thing in the way? Is it okay? I don't know if you can see it up here. I'm watching Zoom. Anything that you can't replicate in prediction should be called training. And that seems like a sort of subtle thought, but I want to show you one example of this that's so important. You see it all the time. Again, I'm not identifying this paper because I like the author and I thought it was mean-spirited to pull out figures and then show things that are wrong with them. But this is a real paper published again this year in tree species. And what you have to do for tree species, right, is you're gonna GPS every stem of the tree, and you're gonna associate that location with a bunch of pixels, and then you might classify them to species, right? Two problems with what we've done here. First is that we've cherry-picked good trees in the landscape and evaluated their score, right? Not all the trees are GPS. What about that tree? What about that tree? It's not a bad thing to do. You just make sure that when you say, hey, now we can predict all the trees in the landscape, you don't mean it. You mean we predicted all the trees in the landscape that were really, really nice to predict. And that's not a bad thing. Science is a progressive process. But don't be confused about the performance of your algorithm. If you can't replicate selecting certain trees during prediction, then it's training. And you want to be really clear about what your evaluation score is actually telling you. Second thing that happens here is that they've hand-drawn crowns around to show the bounds of their trees. So like, okay, they're like, I GPS this tree and that thing looks like the crown. I'm gonna associate that sensor data with, I don't remember this, like it's a dead tree, ironically, it's a dead tree, right? So that thing is gonna go into a neural network and tell you it's dead. The problem is during prediction, you don't get to hand draw the crowns. If you had 100 million trees, you don't get to hand draw all those crowns. So now your evaluation score is nested within a training regime. And so when you go to publish or when you go to use this, when you tell the Nature Conservancy, you can count all the dead trees in California, which they've asked us to do recently. You can't have an evaluation score which reflects training processes. And so you want to be very clear about what you're doing and what you're actually evaluating. And so I'll sort of get off my soapbox here, but what you really need to understand is how your evaluation routines relate to your data, because these pitfalls happen all the time. So this is an example from my own work where this went terribly wrong. We were annotating both points, individual birds in the Everglades to make a bird detector. And then because it was too laborious to draw boxes, so we took each point and we expanded the box to make a certain size. We're like, oh, a bird's like 2.5 meters. So like make a point, make a little buffer on it, and we'll call that an annotation. That seems like totally reasonable. We had 50,000 of these to do. The problem is the neural network learned that birds are exactly the same size. So now we have a bird detector that predicts birds of always the same size, no matter what. Million annotations, a million predictions, not one variance in size. And what happens here is that things like this, which is like very clear, it's like you are going to be that box. And so you really got to be careful about the way in which you engage with your data, because this stuff happens constantly. And so now we had to like go back and artificially make boxes of different sizes to try to figure out how to make a neural network now that will be flexible to this kind of angle. I want to be really clear here that science as a application versus science as a sort of publishing cultural process, what we used to call the little s versus capital S science, is really different for computer vision than it is for ecology. This is a very good paper, which I'm going to actually give the citation for because it's such a good paper, from tree detection. And what I want you to see, though, is that, and I know this is something Sarah's talked about, we want computer vision for ecology to actually save people time. And if it takes you a year to develop an algorithm, you probably should have just counted the trees in your image if you were only, for example, 1% better than an off-the-shelf tool. This is faster RCNN. You can run this thing in 7 hours the first day. This is their algorithm that probably took 18 months to make. It's 1% better. And that's really clear. There's nothing wrong with that from a computer vision research perspective. Maybe that 1% will lead someone else to think about something that'll be 10% better. And then we slowly build on the shoulders of others. We all know that. But don't be confused as to the goals of research in computer vision versus our goals in application, because those things can be divorced very quickly. So this is a very good paper using very sophisticated and thoughtful tools that was 1% better than the dumbest thing you could do that would take you less than a day. That's just there's nothing else to say about that. That just is what happened. So I want to go through a little bit about what a typical research project looks like at our lab at the University of Florida, because I'm hoping, and Sarah told me to basically, tell a little bit about what are the tools we use, how do we actually sort of mechanistically do this from a sort of practitioner's perspective. Sarah, if I've gone off mandate, just yell at me.
No, this is great.
Okay, so this is like a typical research project, right? There's hundreds of these things. This is one where we are in the Everglades now. Most of you know that the Everglades is a wetland ecosystem in South Florida. What I didn't know is that it's mostly managed by very large canals and dikes, which means that there are active decisions about water level being made almost every day, which means that the Army Corps of Engineers has to literally turn on spigots of giant old submarine engines to fire water in different locations. It's pretty cool. And because of that, they have competing goals, as you can imagine, just like every other water management system in the world. We need to get water to Miami for drinking. We need storm protection buffers, and we have wildlife mandates. Most importantly, from the Army Corps' perspective, because they would like not to be sued, is that wood stork are on the endangered species. And so there are several, for example, the Nature Conservancy watches the Army Corps like a hawk. And if anything happens to wood storks populations, lawsuits will be inevitable. And so the legal implications of water management is very real. And because of that, the Army Corps of Engineers has asked my lab to count the wading bird populations at very broad scales, basically over the entire southern third of the Everglades every year, to understand what's happening when they make these different water management decisions. And so you can imagine this is a computer vision problem, right? We can't walk through the Everglades, even with an airboat, to count all the birds. It's impossible. It's a very treacherous ecosystem. It covers a massive area. It would be incredibly dangerous. And so there is no real alternative for terrestrial observation. So we've got to go collect a bunch of images, which we did by drone and by manned aircraft. We designed a little Zooniverse app, which we made private. Zooniverse is actually very open to you hijacking their system just to use it as an annotation tool. I found it to be very effective and useful. You can make it available to citizen scientists should you like. And I think Rowan is here for Drones for Ducks. I know that's an option, but we've just used it to just like have an avenue to use in an annotation environment. It's quick, it's dirty, it's easy. That has worked for us. And so it's flexible. And so we have had maybe 70,000 annotations of things like, what species is this bird? We click on it. Is there a nest there? Can we identify different parts of distortion? Do we see any eggs? And we annotate everything we can. One of the things we've learned is that you should over annotate while you're staring in front of an image. You don't want to have to waste time to go back to annotate something a second time. So if you think something's going to be important to you, annotate it. It's very fast while you're there, but going through and creating a whole second annotation scheme for like behavior the second time around is very annoying. So just try to brainstorm, like, what are the uses of this data? How am I going to annotate it? And how many annotations do I need? And we've used Zooniverse in a private capacity for that. I've talked to them about this. They're very open to it. Okay, so that's annotations. For model development, I extremely recommend Comets. It's free for academics. It's a place to learn, keep track of all of your models. Basically, you attach a single line of Python code, which is called a Comet experiment, and it shoots to this little dashboard, and it will keep track of your metrics, your graph, your hyperparameters, your performance, each of these little lines. If this is just a screenshot, but I could click into it, it'll show you figures. It's a lovely startup out of New York. I have no relationship with them besides that I was one of their very first users. And I confirmed yesterday that it's still free for academics. I extraordinarily recommend it. There are other exactly same tools. One's called like wand and biases. There's 7 different ones of these things. I have found Comet to be extremely useful, and I highly recommend it because one of the paradigms, which is really important when you're developing models, even though you might be tempted to, for example, change a bunch of stuff and see what happens, the simple paradigm of changing one thing, seeing what happens, changing one thing, and seeing what happens is laborious and the only solution. Don't jump steps, just do it. It's very painful. Change one thing, see what happens. And with Comet, you can clearly see, okay, my performance went from here to here, and you can compare everything. It's useful. Everything should go on GitHub, and it's not just for open and reproducibility, which is cool, but there's connections through Comet, for example, to compare code among things. So every commit, the way we do it, every experiment is one commit. So you might see here, there are 3,000 commits. It's really ridiculous. There have been 3,000 experiments in this project. That way, every time I can go back to an exactly one commit and have my model with those hyperparameters and that data and that architecture, and I can go back in time, which means that you could ask me what my model looked like in December 27th, 2019, and I can tell you with 100% confidence because they're one commit, they're time-stamped, they're comparable, they're completely contained. So with GitHub and Comet connected, you will never have to guess about what your model used to look like, and you'll never have to worry about messing up because you can always just revert. It also allows other people to look at your code very easily and quickly, and I highly recommend it. Okay, 2 other things that are important in terms of the actual stack here. Stop me, Sarah, if you already covered all this stuff. I use PyTorch Lightning, which is a wrapper around PyTorch. It keeps the amount of code you need to write low. I don't know what you guys have been looking at this week, but I find Lightning very useful. And it is just a very straightforward paradigm for model development. I highly recommend it. And lastly, when you need to scale, just like put this in your brain. You probably are not there yet, but like you have a supercomputer probably at your university, or you have access to Amazon or AWS or any of these other cloud things. And now you need to make predictions on 1 million images or 100 million images. How are you going to organize those experiments and those prediction pipelines? We use Dask, which is an amazing tool for visualization of Hive servers. That's probably not going to be helpful or meaningful to you guys right now, but just put it in your brain. Dask is a scalable Python architecture for prediction and is the thing we use to make it work when we have millions or tens of millions of images to predict. Okay, so in that Everglades, we went through that whole process. We developed a very simple RetinaNet object detection model. I've done a terrible job here of annotations in black. I've noticed this now. You can't see that at all. Red are predictions, black are annotations, but you're just gonna have to believe me because there are black boxes there, but that's useful on my screen and not on yours. And so what we've learned is that we can predict birds very well. This again speaks to that first thing I said, is that with the right annotations and the right data and a reasonable question, like a human can do this, we know we're going to be successful. So we have a Everglades bird detector. Awesome. What can we do with that? And I think this is the real difference in the paradigm between 5 years ago and now. So this is part of what I was sort of trying to allude to at the top of the talk, which is that the last 5 years were like, is this possible? Should we be working on this? Who should be working on this? What kind of things are involved in it? I would like us as students and as practitioners to move beyond those first set of questions. No more publishing like which architectures are good, or like I made a model for the Everglades. Like we can do that, but I think what we need to ask ourselves is how to go beyond that. Given that this is going to work, how do we then take this and adapt it for our own research programs to make this not that we're mimicking computer vision research, but actually taking this into the ecological space? So what I mean by that is, how do we take the kind of questions we're interested in and make it applicable for us? Here comes a kitten who's going to walk right in front of the camera. There's a tail. Okay.
Oh.
Thanks. That's a tail. Her name is Cricket, and she's in the way. And so we have to think about it from an ecologist perspective. So one of the things that we want to know, for example, is nesting regimes in these birds. So we thought to ourselves, okay, if we georectify these images and we know where they are on the Earth's surface, and we repeat surveys over time, how likely is it that a bird is sitting on a nest? That is really a question of how likely is it that we're going to detect a bird that's in the exact same location among multiple weeks. If you have a colony of 50,000 birds and you sample each week in a drone, and you get an object detection algorithm that says there's a bird here, and then you overlay them, what reasons might there be that in 7 of the 9 images, 7 of the 9 weeks, you have a bird on top of each other? One of them might be that it's sitting on a nest. So we were starting to figure out and play with this kind of idea, which is that we have 3 states: present, that is the algorithm detected it; absent, the algorithm said it wasn't there and it's true; and misclassified. The algorithm said it wasn't there, but it was there. And so now, those of you who are of Bayesian persuasion see where I'm going with this. We have a 3-stage model. We're trying to model the ability for a neural network ensemble of temporal structures to detect nests. And so now we have a specific error structure that we're trying to look at. And so this is what we're working on right now, is trying to make this into a sort of a demographic survey idea. And so we are taking presence, and I think what we're doing, if I remember correctly, is 4 out of 6. If there's 4 presences out of every 6 surveys, we're calling it a nest, and then we're sending someone to that location to evaluate them. Because what we know is the algorithm is very good at detecting birds, and that it's about as good as humans. It's about as good as a variance among people. But we weren't sure about how much this georectification process might be a problem, right? It could be slightly to the side, slightly to the no side, and the artifacts of the image might be a big deal. And so what we hoped was, can we actually see evidence of nests and try to evaluate them? And so we've gotten pretty far at this. And the answer right now is we're at about 77% accuracy, which is that 77% of the time for which our algorithm detects a nest, by which we mean 4 of 6 temporal surveys, is it actually a nest? And so this ability, that depending on your persuasion, that number may seem low or may seem high, but the promise here is in scale, right? Given that, we can then monitor 50,000 nests at once, right? And that's where the promise comes in, is that no human could do that, because we have these massive colonies of white ibis, for example, 25,000, nesting pairs, for example. And if we can survey them every week, we can start to look at the demographic processes related to nest structure, nest abandonment, and start to get closer to actual ecology. The way this ends up looking is that we have...
Ben, we have a question. Is that okay?
Yeah, get in here.
Do you see the little birds once they hatch? Like, can you see them in the time series eventually, or do they just fly really fast?
Oh, no, you can see them. In fact, sometimes you can see eggs, and we're trying to think about, my boss, Morgan Ernest, likes to call it our ring of sticks detector. She would like a ring of sticks detector. We call this bird, because Morgan's really good at naming stuff. So if you actually think right there, you can see a pair of eggs. 1, 2 eggs. There they are. 1, 2 eggs. And so the question right now is it better to, and this becomes an ecology question, right? Is it better to look at the presence of parents as a demographic indicator versus direct demographic information in terms of nests or eggs on nests. How much disturbance is in one versus the other. And so now we're getting closer to ecology versus just computer vision, right? We're also getting closer to actual quantitative ecology, which is sort of where my background comes in, because we can start describing this as a normal kind of presence absence survey, right? Some of you might be familiar with normal detection, hierarchical detection models, right? But we can think about this as the observed presence absence nest is conditional on the weak state, given our ability to detect nests. Just our ability now is no longer the observer ability, but the algorithm's ability. So now the question is, and I'm not going to show you the answer to this slide because we're still working on it. What are the error bounds and error structures which describe the algorithm's ability to detect something versus what a human would do? And there is 60 years of research from Proxy and all these people about how a human behaves in terms of repeat surveys and the kinds of error structures and hierarchical Bayesian structures we're interested in. There is absolutely zero research on how a machine learning algorithm with all of its upstream propagated uncertainty should be modeled in terms of error. And so what I hope to convince you of today is that our existing set of tools, things that you are comfortable with, things you have been taught in grad school, are the same kind of tools we want to use, but we're just trying to scale them up to use neural networks in the observation process. But we need to still think about them as just an observation process. They're not special, there's no magic box here. We want to think about them using the traditional kinds of statistical models we have, and we need to marry the computer vision part of this with the actual quantitative ecology part of this. That is the future moving forward, because that'll allow us to ask things like, how many nests are there? When does initial nesting phenology start? What's the rate of nest survival? You can imagine these kind of things. It'll just have propagated neural network uncertainty. I think I saw a question.
Yeah, in your papers, do reviewers expect you to verify, since it is sort of a newer method, do reviewers expect you to like verify this method like as you're like developing your results? Because it just seems like I could see a critique being like you're using a model to predict a model, or like this method, like this error propagation that you're talking about.
For sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's two answers to that. One is that review for this space, this is a little cop-out answer to start with, and I'll give a better answer. One is that reviewers in this space right now are struggling to understand the breadth of things we're capturing, right? Because we've got quantitative ecology, we've got machine learning, and we've got population demography. And so because of that, you have to sort of couch the way in which you're thinking about the science as focusing on one or the other. And so when we tend to write papers, we think of them as having sort of two auxiliary themes and then one central theme. This paper is about population biology, and so we're going to focus on that. This paper is about neural networks, but it has this population biology and quantitative ecology thing going into it. And so I try to stress, especially to grad students, although I don't see that many grad students there. I think you guys are all postdocs and researchers, but I try to stress grad.
It's like half grad students.
Okay, half grad students. Forget papers. Papers are just a way of reporting your results so that the public and or other researchers understand it. Think about is it building a research program. Any given paper is just a snippet of what you're trying to do. And so what we try to do is cut pieces of this research and then build them together in a series of papers. Because if you were to try to jam this all into one, reviewers would be terrified. And it's just so much, right? You could write a 90-page paper with a 150-page appendix on like all the things that went wrong. And so we think about it as trying to angle one of our three themes and then sort of aggregating them together. Because for example, I haven't even told you about species classification, because now we've just talked about birds. We got to classify each of those to species. And the uncertainty is compounded because are the bird detections cross-species accurate? Are you getting a nest of the right species? Because if we said isogy was 4 of 6 temporal slices, what if 3 of those temporal slices is correctly roseate spoonbill, but one of them's white ibis? You can imagine the error landscape here is genuinely complex, needs to be simulated and thought about very carefully. And so we are building these tools and building these thoughts. And what I hope to convince you of is not like how cool this is, because in general, this is like one research project. It's just what it is what it is. But really what I want to convince you of is that we are moving back into ecology. We are in this space where we're starting to think more about how this comes to our systems and not just sort of like moonlighting as machine learning engineers. And I hope that we can take that away from us, because the truth is that we are going to have to make this part of our research program. I was told actually by Casey's advisor many years ago that when Bayesian statistics started out, it was a thing of like you went to a math department and got a Bayesian collaborator. Like you had a Bayesian question, you would go and go get a collaborator who would help you do that. And sometime during the last 20 years, it became part of the standard curriculum for biological statistics in ecology. And my hope, and Sarah's doing an amazing job of helping all of you see this as well, is that computer vision will be folded into ecology as a standard set of tools. It's not special. And that will allow us to take it back a little bit from computer science, because the truth is that collaboration with computer science, which I can talk about ad nauseum if you're interested in, is difficult, involving competing currencies and different incentive structures. And because of that, the truth is that it's going to be on applied ecologists to be running these things, at least for many projects. It's not always true, but a lot of the work will be done by people like you and I, rather than people with PhDs in computer science. And that's a very open and interesting question, but we'll leave that there for the moment. So the last tool I want to share with you that I think is really important is that, right, if you're developing a model, you understand its ins and outs and you understand what went into it. But when you want to show it to a policymaker, when you want to show it to someone who's an end user, you have to think about how you're going to actually share that. And it's very difficult to communicate just in terms of evaluation statistics. You telling someone that your fish counting algorithm is 72% accurate at getting salmon across this dam is not going to convince someone to spend $1 million implementing it. There's something about the numeric value here that is just unconvincing. It also doesn't reflect what humans do, because no one cross-verifies humans. So like in the fish counting perspective, which actually I think some of you in the room probably are familiar with, right? Like you might have a person at a fish ladder like looking at stuff, and they never have a second person like cross-validating what their accuracy is. So they think they're 100% accurate, which of course is ridiculous, right? So now you've created this standard that 76% accurate just because we're actually measuring it somehow seems like a dearth. And so the politics around presenting machine learning results to stakeholders is actually quite sensitive, and you need to think about how you want to present that. What we've done is build little shiny apps. Let's see if this is going to work. When I go to screen 2 here, let's see what happens here. Hold on. I got to get out of this. It's always terrifying doing live demos. Can everyone see a shiny app?
Yeah.
Cool. So I promise this is not complex. Anyone can build a shiny app in like 2 hours. All this is a bunch of clicking drop-down menus that show a bunch of predictions. But this has been very effective at sharing our data with the Army Corps of Engineers, because they just don't care about our evaluation statistics or any of the words we say. This is all they care about. This is genuinely it. So here is a bunch of time series. Each of these dots is a drone survey. We uploaded each orthomosaic tile to Mapbox, which is fairly inexpensive, which can serve it back to you as tiles. You can then overlay your annotations onto that, and thing shiny, you can click on them. This seems like, okay, like obviously, this has been transformative in terms of convincing people about the utility of our algorithms, because for whatever reason, telling someone that we have like an 87% accurate bird detector and a 72% accurate species model, people are like, oh, that doesn't seem like that good. But then when you overlay it on images, they're like, wow, that's the most amazing thing ever. And I don't know why, but it's true. And so these are really important. And so each of these things is a confidence score and a class. They're colored. People love colors, love colors. And so what you can do, for example, is show, like, hopefully this will work. Let's see. So we're at all species. One of our geographic sites is Jewel, and then we can like slide our little temporal bar and it will load a new drone tile from another week of that survey. This is a tree island in the Everglades, and we can look at a bunch of things and look at a bunch of predictions. We're missing some right there. And we might overlay multiple weeks. I should get it to stay the same geographic location. I didn't think about that. It's also a really nice way of assessing things that go terribly wrong with your model. For example, we get in this crazy like lily pad prediction thing, or like here's like an empty nest that's like a weird great blue, like that's a great blue heron for some reason. These are really important things for understanding the outliers, because obviously we weren't showing any data of like empty sticks to our model, and that might be an area of concern for model evaluation. And so visualizing at these prediction scales and going beyond your evaluation data is really useful, because it'll show you things that kind of went terribly wrong. Like this thing is just a red stick. That's just like a red stick. That's a really good spoonbill, right? And so these kind of pieces, and it can be scary to be honest, but I want to stress to everyone in the room that you should be the biggest critic of your model, and you should be the biggest critic of what it can do. And if you find yourself having to sell something, your thing is probably not ready. And you should be trying to bring, the best case scenario is that you're trying to bring policymakers back away from the model. That's when you know you've won. They're like, we should apply this everywhere all the time. You're like, actually, maybe we should think about it. And like, if you find yourself trying to back people away from what you've done, that is a really important place to be, because now you're in control of what you think is an appropriate use case, versus being like, I think this could be the thing that changes everything. You know what I mean? You want to be very careful about selling your model. Okay, so these kind of tools with drop-down menus are really useful. It's just a shiny app that is probably only 70 lines of code in R. And I'm happy to share whatever with people, but it's fairly straightforward. All right, let's go back to the top. How are we doing so far, everybody? Doing okay? We haven't even gotten to anything like fun yet. This is all. All right, so what? Okay, hold on. I'm gonna go back to the actual. We're back on the PowerPoint kind of structure.
Yeah.
Okay, so the question becomes, all right, that was like one research project, but like we can't do that for every ecological question in all of ecology. There's not enough people with the technical skills or money or annotations to do that, right? We're in trouble if that is the paradigm that we're going to live in. There's not enough postdocs out there to do that, right? We would need hundreds of them. And this isn't, I hope you will not see this as self-serving, but rather a reflection of where the field is. My inbox is so full of like people wanting to do this on one bespoke thing. And it's not because of my quality. It's just because there just isn't enough people, right? And so this is an example from yesterday. Couldn't make this up. I got a researcher in French Guiana writing me about ant identification that they've taken with cell phone pictures, right? Maybe this is the most important transformative project in the world, but like, I don't have time to like suddenly moonlight as a ant classification expert, right? And so what we need to do is a pipeline of either students who are ready to take on these research programs, or finding a way to transcend this design of a project that has high annotation cost, large technical barriers to entry, and massive redundancy. Every person starting from every same time. Why should every shark researcher start from nothing, right? So how do we go beyond this? The hope is that we can start building general models that transcend any given geography, but start to work on simple taxa. So we chose birds as the first thing. I want to thank a ton of co-authors. There's probably 30 co-authors on this paper. We got, I think it was 350,000 annotations from different research projects around the world, including penguins. I don't know where this is, Casey. This is Heather, though. And so we've got people all over the world who are identifying individual birds and images. It's all the same. Drones, Rowan's data is in here too on sandhill cranes. Trying to figure out how we build a bird detector model, one that works for the globe, for drones. And it seems a little crazy to say out loud, but when you think about it, it's not that crazy because Argentina. I've never been flying in a plane in Argentina looking down at rayas, but like, I'm pretty sure that if you showed me a picture, I could do a reasonable job of detecting them. Something about the human brain allows us to transcend and sort of put ourselves in that space. But what I told you at the top of the talk is that generalization is not free in neural networks. You can't build a albatross model from the Falklands and expect it to identify boobies from Australia. It's just not a thing. What you need to do is figure out how we can mimic some kind of set of human intelligence or some kind of understanding that allows us to go beyond this model design. And so this is the babiest of baby steps. This is nothing sophisticated, but it's literally the first thing we have to try, which is taking a bunch of images from all over the world and putting them together and see what happens. It's the most naive thing to do. It's also the first thing to do, and that makes it the thing I was going to do. So we got research projects from all over the world, and we simply just annotated them together, put them in common formats. And the only piece of interesting technical detail here is that drones are not required to fly at the same height, nor do they have the same cameras. So they need to have some kind of, then the model can't be so sensitive to resolution that it has to think about the size of birds, because there's no geographic understanding in a neural network, right? It's just pixels. So it doesn't know that your thing's 2 meters wide, and now you're flying at twice the height, so it's 8 meters wide. It doesn't have any idea of relative size or structure. And so we had to play with data augmentation strategies to make this work. And so augmentation can be really important. Literally what we ended up doing was cropping bits out, zooming in and zooming out, and trying to mimic a drone coming closer or further. That's not the greatest idea, but it kind of worked. And so it was enough to start out with. And the big question here is training on data from the Falklands useful for South Africa? Is training on data from the Arctic useful for the Antarctic? Because we know transfer learning as a paradigm, using a model trained on one thing to be retrained on another, is useful, but we don't know the limits of that. We don't know why it works really, and we don't know when it's going to work. There's no predictive fashion. I know this is something Sarah's probably talked to you guys about, rapid model verification, but we need rapid backbone verification. When is a transfer learn model going to be useful for your new project? So this was the very, very simplest thing to try, which is if you have no annotations from your local site, how does the backbone perform? Versus if you have 1,000 annotations from your local site, how's the backbone perform? And all you need to take away from this is that it performs well. Adding annotations is useful, and you start from a higher place with a local backbone. And so what we can see here is that we get increases in recall and precision starting from this backbone, and that only 1,000 local annotations takes us to a fairly reasonable recall score, usually between 0.75 and 1. That's lovely. And a reasonable precision score. There are a couple examples that we have decreases in precision. I have theories about this, but I would say that it needs to be better studied. I believe it has something to do with trade-offs in the resolution structure, but this is, again, still to be determined. And I think what the main go ahead.
Ben, isn't that same class that you're seeing a reduction in precision? You're seeing a massive uptick in
I know.
recall?
I don't know.
So those things, no, that makes total sense to me. Those things are a trade-off, right? You get better at detecting stuff, but then you're likely to predict more things and have more false positives. I think that makes sense to me.
And so what the takeaway here is that a general model is possible, but functionally all it's doing is encoding annotations from one place to another. And so the real thing we've learned from a general bird detector, which is out, by the way, it's on Deep Forest. If you want to Google it, bird detector, use it. It's awesome. It's just a baseline for you to start from. But really, it's just a way of encoding annotations. It didn't have any technical thing there. It was just a compressed version of some annotations that were used other places. And so what that leads us to believe is that the fundamental thing we need to do is figure out the largest number of annotations from the most diverse set of images for your potential prediction space. And so this gets back to that sort of 3 key rules I talked about at the top, that annotations always matter. And in some ways, transfer learning is a way of us showing that. It's just a compressed version of some low dimensional representation of those annotations, if that makes sense. That's sort of the way I think about it. So given the fact that not all of us are going to have 1 million annotations, or that are things maybe genuinely rare? You know, I was talking to snow leopard people the other day, and they're like, there's not enough snow leopards in the world to annotate a neural network. They're endangered. And so like, there's literally not enough individuals on Earth to annotate. And so there has to be some kind of game we need to play. So I want to talk to you a little bit about semi-supervision. And what I think about this is just games we play to get more annotations, or games we play to get some kind of data that can be compressed as annotations. And I think this is one of the places that ecology will be really useful, because those annotations and the games we're going to play need to be ecologically relevant. So that is something you always need to remember during this whole sort of segment, is think about, for your research question, how can I play this kind of game that's ecologically relevant? So we're going to talk about tree detection. Literally, we're talking about putting bounding boxes around trees. So each tree should get a box. This shouldn't be understated as a ridiculously hard, almost farcically hard problem, right? Trees come in all sorts of different representations on Earth. They grow in three-dimensional structures. They overlap. A lot of fundamental principles about object detection from a computer vision perspective are sort of being broken here. And so the traditional benchmarks within computer vision don't necessarily reflect all the challenges we have. But it should be said that we're like not the first people to want to do this. So the first thing you should think about when trying to harness annotations in some way is, what has previous research done? That might be literally annotations, people clicking on stuff, or it might be algorithms we can generate annotations from. So perhaps you see where I'm going with this. For tree detection, using LiDAR, these three-dimensional point clouds, there have been an immense number of papers that basically go like this. If there's a point within 2 feet of another point that's like kind of like a tree, call it a tree. They come up with these heuristic rules that come with angles and distances to come up with individual trees. They don't work very well because they're sort of handcrafted features with a bunch of little knobs you can tune to work for your particular study site. And you can imagine that that's very brittle, that the knobs you turn for the distance among trees, for example, might work in the Sahel, but suddenly be terrible in tropical Amazon. And so there's just not enough knobs in that algorithm to make it work. But the virtue of this is we can use it as an unlabeled source of annotations. So we can use existing algorithms to take an immense amount of plentiful data we have. So this is for the National Ecological Observatory Network, NEON, which collects terabytes of airborne data over 42 sites in the United States. And we're going to take a lot of unlabeled sites and run our algorithm that exists. It was published years ago in the R LiDAR package, and generate millions of weak labels. And what we're going to do is to try to come up with a paradigm for pre-training our neural network given these weak labels, because we know each of those tree predictions are going to be kind of bad. If they weren't bad, we wouldn't be doing this research project in the beginning, right? We'd already be done. So we know they're going to be of somewhat low quality. So we want to do this left-hand side millions of times. Take some LiDAR data, get a canopy height model, use our existing tree prediction algorithm to make a bunch of tree prediction locations. Then we're going to take our RGB data, overlay our predicted locations, train a neural network, and then at the very end, hand annotate a bunch of images and retrain our neural network based on quality. The way I usually describe this is that I've got a 5-year-old who's learning to read. You don't hand a 5-year-old Shakespeare. You don't hand a 5-year-old the best literature you have. When I see someone train a neural network from completely random initializations, all I think about is 5-year-olds and Shakespeare. You've taken the best quality thing you have and given it to something that knows nothing. It doesn't even know what color is yet, but like you're talking about Hamlet. And so what I want to stress to you is 2,000 annotations of walruses, and it doesn't know what red is yet, you're probably making a mistake. And so what we think about here is trying to build the vocabulary. The way you teach a 5-year-old to read is like you read Dr. Seuss first, you talk about sentences, you talk about structure. So this whole left-hand side of this training pipeline is just trying to build a vocabulary of features before we get to the high quality data over here. And we don't want to waste Hamlet on 5-year-olds. There's another takeaway for you. So the question was, what's this going to work? Here's the performance of our unsupervised algorithm. Some of you might have seen this stuff. This is pretty old now. We've taken an unsupervised algorithm, and that's the performance of the algorithm we're using to do tree detection. what it looks like is this, right? It has no spectral understanding. So like this rock is a tree. This is probably one tree. And we can tune it, but I promise you that given a diversity of trees across the entire continent, you're not going to ever tune it to like be perfect. It's always going to have some errors. And so we can use millions of these to train a neural network. We're going to get better results. This on its own, by the way, is kind of fascinating. It's sort of the no free lunch theorem, which is that like we took something bad and we trained it in RGB space, but we did a lot of it. We made it better. I do have theories about how this works, but suffice to say that I'm not the only person. I didn't invent semi-supervised learning. There is theory here, but it is kind of magical that you went from something bad and you did bad a lot of times and you got something better. There is interesting things here. So then we take the hand annotations, take that Shakespeare and add it on top of. But remember, we weren't sure what's going to happen because we had lots of weak annotations, millions of them, and we only had like 10,000 boxes of high quality. Was it going to move the neural network? And the answer was yes. And so we got really excited and we started trying to visualize it. So this is what this looks like. Here's an unsupervised algorithm. Here's the pre-trained RGB on the weak annotations from LiDAR. And then here's the retrained hand annotations. This is all prediction space. And so not only does the algorithm do better with trees, but if you look at it, the confidence scores also increase. So not only is it getting better, but it's getting better calibrated as well. And so the next step was like, okay, can we do this a bunch of different forests? So we did it for every neon site and we released it as a Python package. It's pip install deep forest. It is in no way perfect. I could work on this all day, every day, especially cross resolution, things like satellite, drone, up and down resolution, big questions there. But it's a start. It's a backbone to start from that allows us to share it with other researchers. And that's what gets me up in the morning. That's what gets me excited. We can then apply this kind of thing at broad
And we have a
scale.
question.
Go for it.
How would you define a weak annotation? What would be the contrast between a weak annotation versus
A weak annotation is a low quality annotation, usually generated by an algorithm, whereas a strong annotation is something you have high confidence in, usually generated by a human.
So for example, you would have like half a tree and not the full tree.
Yeah, they were like, it
In
would
the
like
bounding box.
something or like some angle, it would be a blob or like two trees, but it's better than like literally nothing.
I think about weak supervision as like cheap supervision.
Yeah.
Like a human didn't have to spend time to generate that label. You got it from, in this case, you used the LiDAR depth and these traditional algorithms to get you labels that no human had to draw.
Okay, so it may be good or bad, but you didn't have to invest time.
You did, or you didn't have to invest, you didn't have to invest human time.
And usually weak comes with large. Like it'd be you wouldn't usually train a very small number of weak annotations because usually the virtue of the weak is that they're cheap, which means you can do a lot of them. It would be unusual to pair like a very small number of weak annotations. Usually it's to scale. And so what we did was we took that algorithm and we applied it to all the neon sites and we made a data set that's up on Zenodo right now of 100 million trees, should you want to click on them and look at 100 million trees. And right now we're trying to work on species classification for each of those trees and trying to understand sort of what the bounds of scale here is. And what I hope to convince you of is that like, this is all doable, right? Like 7 years ago, I didn't know anything about this. And I was memorizing 6,000 species of bird to cite, right? Like it's not magic. It's not that difficult. Really, the challenge is in thinking about how we put this together and now bringing it to sort of the next step. And what I want to end this talk on is sort of what I hope this next step is and what everyone's role could be. So here's a wish list of like my research program for the next 30 to 40 years, right? Here, where do we need to go with this? This is not gonna happen anytime soon, but like, what is the aim, right? We need to be able to generalize across time and space so that neural networks sort of mimic what I was saying about Reyes in Argentina, our ability to transcend and expect new locations. That is going to involve massive, probably unsupervised training. We need to be able to have neural networks that agglomerate information from multiple sensors and conditions, probably resolutions. Satellite data is becoming more and more attainable. I just bought some data from 30 centimeters from the Neopleiades, where you can see individual birds from space. How do we integrate that with drone data at 1 centimeter? 30 centimeter space data, 1 centimeter drone data. How do you cross-train? What's the best way to do that? Those are big, open, and interesting questions. I think you heard about in one of your other talks, the iNaturalist, which is starting to move us towards some sort of nested classification for the tree of life scale. We want to be able to say, hey, I was out in nature and I saw a lizard and that was not a jellyfish. Like we may not be able to get to the fine-grained taxonomy, but the kinds of things that a 10-year-old should be able to identify are the kind of things that I hope we can identify at a global scale. It's a bear, not a wolf. That might be too hard. It's the bear and not a squid. We need rapid model verification. I know this is something that Sarah's passionate about, right? We have millions of research projects coming our way, so many needs, so many agencies, so many conservation organizations. How do we know which models to choose? How do we know when a model is sufficient? And what kind of annotation strategies do we need? That's a massive area of work that I think is super important. And then we need some sort of way of guiding, sort of completing the loop as we think about it, is that AI-assisted field surveys. So not just that like you have a corpus of data, which things should I annotate first, but where should I go in my research program? Where should I go on Earth to get new annotations to make this neural network better? There needs to be a feedback loop between the model living in the computer and the real space, such that we can figure out how to make it better actually at the role. So that leads me to my last thought, which is that I truly believe there's a role for everyone in this future. It may seem highly technical, it may seem difficult, but what I want to leave you with is I genuinely believe that this is something ecology can do as a community. Field researchers, we need people collecting data and developing expertise. We're not trying to replace anyone. There is no replacement here. This is human-computer collaboration. And if I can ask a favor of everyone, every time you hear someone say that like AI is coming for your job or making a little joke about like robots are taking over, stop them, be like, no, that's not what we're doing. No one wants that. That will do me a lot of good, because the cultural understanding that like we are like coming for field ecology or something, or like self-driving cars, is farcical and not the goal and not even really relevant. We need to move beyond that paradigm. There's a role for natural history researchers because we need people who understand their taxa. A neural network is just a low dimensional compressed representation of someone's brain who spent all their life identifying bee genitalia, right? Like that is all we're really trying to do. And so all we're trying to do is I could do this all day. And so we're going to work with the public and trying to figure out where these organisms are. I think eBird has done an amazing places, and we can think of as weak data, again, low quality, but huge amounts of public data. That's the same true for images. That's being more and more used, things like Flickr and Instagram. We know there's a really important role here for statisticians of trying to understand how we use the outputs of neural networks in real probabilistic models that make a difference, and that can be presented to policymakers in a believable and rigorous way. And then at the end of all of that, I haven't said anything yet, we have people who develop algorithms. Don't worry about the algorithms. If we solve all those other problems, the algorithms will solve themselves. That is the last thing we need to worry about. We need to worry about everything else first, and then we will sort of move towards this greater future. And with that, I want to thank everybody. It's always fun, and I'm happy to take questions. Email me, Twitter, anything. I'm around. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah, ready.
So I have two questions. One of them is about the data augmentation. You were saying that showing the algorithm, say a bird in the Arctic, is it going to work for the Sahara? Are you doing any augmentation other than zooming, like maybe cropping the bird out and then changing the background? Or is that something that, okay.
It's the simplest thing to start with first. The next thing, of course, is trying to understand what is the optimal way of putting, for example, batches together or different pieces of data, because we think of things of sort of effective sample size, right? If two of your turn images look exactly the same, you're just causing overfitting in your neural network. And so there are starting to be algorithms, I'm not an expert in them in any way, shape, or form, of trying to predict which data in your set is most informative And I think that's massively important because everything that you're putting into your neural network that's not informative is just a form of overfitting.
There's also a flip side of that, which is like finding also the things that are the most confusing sometimes and taking them out.
Yeah.
So if you have outliers that are like actually really, you can figure out what is the most confusing for your model. And if you think it's not very useful, you can try to remove it.
And does that also help with interpretability of the model? Like if you're understanding what confuses it?
I mean, visualizing results helps you interpret your own model, but I don't know that like looking at this information bottleneck and like trying to understand what are like informative, diverse examples versus examples that are like forcing you to learn like classifiers that are really weird. Like one thing we run into a lot is in camera traps. If you have something that's like the animal's gotten really close to the camera and it's just like a blurry blob, and then you try to force your model to learn to categorize the different species of blurry blob that can get close to the camera, you're basically like forcing the model to draw arbitrary boundaries that are like not reasonable. But I don't know that that helps you with interpretability.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question is less about interpretability and more like, how do we marry the output of these things with statistical methods that describe its uncertainty? It's a really interesting and difficult question. I've been dealing with this with counts, for example, where we just want to count the number of trees of certain species in the landscape. So we run a bounding box detection algorithm, gets tree crowns, we classify each of them to species. So we got to count. What's the error bounds on that count? I can't tell someone that there's 476 magnolias in this landscape. There needs to be some set of error, but describing that error structure is non-trivial and clearly something we need to continue to think about.
That's overwhelming. My other question was, when you showed the bird algorithm, you said that you first started with the dots and then you expanded it to a bounding box. Would randomizing the size of the bounding box be helpful?
Probably.
Like giving some, like if you just give some kind of a random size instead of like actually marking it, like do you think the algorithm would learn?
I think that's what he said they started doing after they
Yeah.
realized.
Okay.
The other thing to do though would be, again, in the weak supervision idea, is to use some existing computer vision algorithm to try to cut out the white parts, right? Like if you have a center, there are things called watershed or like watershed marking kind of things that would fill in. So it would sort of flow into the white parts. And so that is a completely reasonable idea. It just wasn't worth it to us in this regard because we're trying to count for nests. But marrying existing neural network architectures with like classical computer vision, I think is really useful here. Like we know they're white, so just grab all the white pixels and then draw the white pixels until they stop being white pixels. Those kinds of things, while seeming really simple, probably will be really useful.
Yeah, like I can imagine you could use, there are lots of different traditional like statistical algorithms for like going from, if you click one dot, like weekly, it's called weekly supervised segmentation, right? You click this is of an object and then you try and fill in all the pixels that are also belonging to that object. And for stuff like this, where there's like within an object, not a lot of variability, and then there's a strong boundary between the object and what's not the object, that type of thing can work very well.
Totally.
And then once you did that thing, then you could just put the box that fit around each of those objects as your detection label.
Yeah.
Or just do segmentation directly.
That would be way more useful than randomizing the size.
Maybe, but it's also, with a lot of this stuff, it's a trade-off, right? And it's like, but then you're gonna have to spend the time to get that thing to work and then do it. And sometimes it's very easy to just say, well, what happens if we just randomly change the size of the box?
Totally.
So there's just like this trade-off.
And that's something that everyone really should stress, which is that like, there's no extra points for doing something cool. And that should be really stressed here, which is that like, we're trying to save time for ecologists and we should be measuring this in terms of time saved for ecologists. So like, if you don't need to do something, don't do it.
Yeah, or there's also, I think about it in terms of like doing things quickly and then exploring beyond it. So it's like, if you're like, I can think of this really complicated way to do this, or I can think of a hack. Usually I'll try the hack first so that I understand how well that does. And then if I'm like, still not as good as I'd hope, then I might invest more time into the more complicated thing. But don't start with the most complicated thing you can think of. Another question, and then we should probably wrap up soonish. Maybe two more questions. Yeah. Ethan.
Yeah, I guess I only have one question. So yeah, I was wondering if you could go back to the slide about the self-supervision work with the trees. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about what the difference between something like that is versus just utilizing some kind of prior on your prediction.
The integration between Bayesian and deep learning is in its infancy. And so what you would have to put a prior on is every weight in your neural network, which would be basically computationally impossible. And so shape priors are totally doable. It's just, I think as Sarah just said, a trade-off in terms of difficulty. This is remarkably easy to do because you just have a pipeline that takes in annotations. And so these annotations have been generated somehow. Whereas a shape prior would probably be much more subtle and sophisticated. And it's pretty clear that I don't do subtle and sophisticated.
One more question? Yeah.
Yeah, so I like talking about these time-saving methods for ecologists to move beyond the methods to get to their ecological questions, right? Using these methods as a jumpstart for that. So I could probably look this up, but since you're working on the tree canopy detection, what are some ecological questions that are getting to be answered with the tree canopy detection?
There's sort of three classes of things we're most interested in. We have collaborators interested in biogeography and understanding the broad scale patterns of tree species prediction. And so when you look at this from a 10,000 individual scale, you start to see the patterns for why species occurrence happens there. So it's for example, comparing abiotic versus management histories. And that kind of spatial thing is very difficult with traditional plot designs because you have to like put a plot there and assume that it's homogeneous. And so species distribution at the landscape scale has been very cool. The second one, I think the thing I'm most passionate about is the fire angle, trying to understand, for example, fire prevalence and how likely an area is to go on fire based on, for example, the size of the tree or the species. And though, again, anything that has to do with smooth spatial structure can't really be attacked by a traditional plot design. You just have to hope your plot lights on fire. Like you have to hope that you've made a plot, measured it, and then sort of darkly hope that that plot then lit on fire later, which is just a really difficult and hard thing to predict unless you intentionally burn it. And then the question is, was that natural? And so those kinds of broad scale things, but when you measure at the scale of entire forests, you can be fairly sure that one fire will get through somewhere sometime. And now you have an ability to assess, for example, how close were two trees when they lit on fire? Which species were more likely to survive the fire, for example? Those kind of things I'm most passionate about. And I think the last one is using a proxy for very fine scale wildlife habitat. You know, we think about these coarse bioclimatic variables as a way of measuring susceptibility or potential habitat, but things like marble murrelet that we've worked with, you know, need specific trees of a specific size. And now we're getting down to that kind of granularity that allow us to actually predict things like demography, whereas before it's like this Landsat variable is correlated with the occurrence of this species.
Cool. Awesome. Let's thank the speaker again. Thank you.
I always clap. I clap for some reason. I always clap.
You can clap for yourself. I liked it.
I clap for you. I clap for you guys. You should be thankful to listen to me for that long.
No, it was fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, you all can contact Ben. He's also quite active on the AI for Conservation Slack channel. So if you want to ping him on there, he almost always responds.